Ukrainian drones St. Russian oil depot, and the blast that followed tore the darkness open like a furnace erupting under pressure. At 4:42 a.m., one of the surviving drones broke from formation, dipped low above the perimeter fence, and charged straight toward Tank 2, its camera locked on a reservoir holding more than 9,000 tons of petroleum. For a brief second, the drone skimmed across the steel surface, engines screaming as it drove into the tank's upper plate. And then the world split open. The impact ruptured the shell, releasing a violent plume of vapor that ignited in a column of flame towering over the valley. The shock front rippled through the complex, twisting catwalks and knocking out the control booths in a single violent pulse. A second tank buckled moments later, its dome tearing apart under the surging pressure as burning fuel spread across the concrete grid. What had begun as a routine pre-dawn shift instantly became a cascading failure no defense team could contain. Before we trace how 8 drones triggered this collapse, let me ask, what would you think if you saw a drone dive into a fuel tank moments before the explosion lit up the sky? 4:15 a.m., the kind of darkness that eats sound, light, and certainty alike. 8 Ukrainian drones drifted over the river basin at 220 meters, their engines barely louder than an old lawnmower in a distant field. No GPS, no radar emissions, nothing for a Russian sensor to lock onto. Just barometric readings updating 10 times a second. And terrain data loaded so deep into their processors it felt almost instinctive, like a creature navigating by memory alone. For the last 52 kilometers, everything had gone flawlessly. But the next 60 seconds would remind everyone why no operation, no matter how carefully rehearsed, ever stays perfect. Drone 8's acoustic sensor twitched first, a low mechanical growl, faint but unmistakable. A Russian utility vehicle crawling along the tree line barely a kilometer off their right flank. The drone's threat model flashed an amber warning. Not hostile, but not harmless either. A single radio call from that truck could illuminate the whole valley. The drone eased downward to 180 meters, drawing a narrow arc along the hillside. Seconds later, Drone 7 reported something worse. High-voltage transmission lines stretching across the valley floor. The onboard processor reacted instantly, a 4-meter climb, a controlled dip, and a return to altitude. The rest of the formation copied the maneuver, one after another, like beads on a string pulling through the dark. It was small turbulence, insignificant in the grand scheme. But inside the Ukrainian command shelter, the operators flagged it as Caution Zone 1, a reminder that the terrain, the cold air, the roaming patrols, all of it could shred the mission before it even truly began. And yet, as the drone settled back into formation, the valley ahead remained silent. Almost too silent for what was coming. 4:22 a.m., a quiet tremor rippled through the Ukrainian command shelter. 2 launch signatures had just appeared on the operator's screens. Neptune M decoys, fired from more than 86 kilometers away. These weren't built to strike anything. They were built to be seen. The first Neptune climbed fast, punching through the low cloud deck at 14,700 feet, its radar cross-section blooming across every Russian display like a flare in the night. The message was crude, obvious, and deliberate. Here I am. Chase me. Russian early warning sites from Bryansk to Kaluga snapped to full alert. Officers scrambled into bunkers. Consoles lit up. Even air defense crews, usually sluggish at this hour, came online in minutes. To them, this looked like the opening move of a much larger Ukrainian Strike A crisis worth shouting about. And that's exactly what Ukraine wanted. Meanwhile, tucked into the folds of the valley below, Drone 3 captured movement. A 3-vehicle convoy crawling up the M2 service road. Not a threat. Yet. One soldier stepped out, stretching his legs in the cold, and froze the moment he heard the faint buzz overhead. A single report over radio would be all it took to unravel everything. The drones fanned wider, their processors shifting into evasive mode. Above them, the second Neptune dropped to 55 feet, weaving between hillsides at 900 kilometers per hour. For a moment, it vanished entirely from Russian radar, blinking off the map like a magician disappearing behind a curtain. Someone in the Russian command center shouted for tracking confirmation. None came. And here's where I want to pull you in, viewer. If you were on that radar console, would you trust your eyes? or panic at the silence? Tell me below, because in the next chapter, that silence is about to be ripped open by rotor blades and tracer fire. 4:29 a.m. The valley exhaled a thin mist as the drones pushed deeper into Russian airspace. Then the quiet broke. An acoustic spike cut through Drone 2's sensor feed. Rotor noise. Heavy. Approaching fast. From a forward airstrip less than 24 kilometers away, a Russian MiG-24 lifted off moments earlier, engines pulling at full torque as it raced toward the unidentified contacts. The pilot, a veteran from older conflicts, flew low and fast at 275 kilometers per hour, trusting instinct more than instruments. His gunner, younger and trained mostly in simulators, scanned the dim horizon through a narrow optical sight. The drones split instantly. Drones 1 and 2 climbed to 260 meters, making themselves bright and obvious. Bait for anything. Hunting drones 3 through 5 dropped into the valley, hugging contours so tight, their altimeters blinked warnings every 3 seconds. And drones 6, 7, 8 veered toward the railroad corridor, slipping into the blind angle between two ridgelines. The Mi-24 locked onto the brightest return, Drone 2. Tracers streaked across the half-light as the gunner opened fire with the 12.7mm cannon, firing nearly 400 rounds in under 10 seconds. Drone 2 vanished from telemetry, its feed cutting to static. Then came the rockets. 4 S-8 projectiles spiraled outward, carving white arcs through the sky. Drone 4 took the full blast, disappearing in a violent white bloom. Drone 5 caught fragments along its left wing, the structural integrity collapsing as it spiraled downward toward the river plain. But the valley struck back. Drone 3 darted between two cliffs separated by barely 30 meters, too narrow for the helicopter's 60-foot rotor span. The Mi-24 overshot, forced to climb to avoid stalling, losing sight of the surviving drones. 5 remained airborne, scattered but intact, and with the helicopter temporarily outmaneuvered, the path toward the oil complex was suddenly, dangerously, open. 4:33 a.m. and the valley's echo of rotor blades finally thinned into the distance. The surviving drones, 5 in total, slipped back into formation, processors recalibrating after the chaos. But this brief calm was nothing more than the inhale before another strike of misdirection. Far to the southwest, the second Neptune M decoy resurfaced. For nearly 3 minutes, it had skimmed along the folds of the terrain at 55 feet, hugging each curve like a shadow sliding along stone. Now, without warning, it pulled into a steep climb, rising past 3,100 feet in less than 20 seconds. To Russian sensors, it was as if something enormous had just leapt out from under the earth. Dozens of radar arrays snapped awake. Warning tones rolled across 3 provinces. Operators scrambled to regain lock, shouting over each other as the Neptune's signal intensified. At the pipeline sector, the Panzer battery commander had been waiting, every muscle coiled, every console glowing red. The moment the missile crossed his engagement line, he authorized a full ripple. 457 E6 interceptors burst upward, each pulling nearly 20 Gs, leaving spirals of condensation in the cold dawn air. A second later, a bloom of overlapping detonations washed across the horizon, bright enough to cast moving shadows across the treetops. In Russian command posts, relief washed over the screens. 2 Neptunes gone. Crisis avoided. Or so they believed. Because while the sky burned to the south, the real threat crept from the north. Drones 6, 7, and 8, flying between 45 and 60 meters, were now tracing the old railway line, the only corridor left unmonitored. Their thermal signatures barely registered above the chilled ground, almost indistinguishable from the metallic rails beneath them. But the Russians weren't done. A second Mi-24 rose from a tree line 2 kilometers ahead, its turbines glowing against the cooling landscape. This crew was sharper, their infrared optics scanning deliberately, patiently. The decoy had done its job. Now the chase would begin again. 4:37 a.m. and the second Mi-24 was already pushing through the treetops, its infrared sensor sweeping a pale beam across the cold terrain. Unlike the first crew, This team conserved ammunition, firing in short, disciplined bursts whenever a faint heat signature flickered across the sight. Drone 6 felt the impact first. 3 rounds pierced its fuselage, slicing through a coolant line. Its processor compensated, adjusting trim every half-second, but altitude bled away regardless. The drone wobbled, fought the airflow, and somehow stayed airborne, reduced but not removed. Drones 7 and 8 banked left, shifting into randomized maneuvering patterns. Every 3 seconds, they altered their headings by a few degrees, an improvised form of evasion coded months earlier for exactly this contingency. But randomness came with a price. One of those turns exposed them to the helicopter's optics. The Mi-24 tagged Drone 7 briefly before losing contrast against the dark forest. The real danger, however, wasn't in the air. It was on the rooftops ahead. Russian ground units had rushed to deploy 4 Igla-S teams around the pipeline sector. The missiles, designed to hunt aircraft burning hundreds of degrees hotter than their surroundings, scanned for any thermal contrast above the pre-dawn chill. But the drone's small engines barely reached 80 degrees above ambient, far too cool for a stable lock. The first missile roared skyward, lost its target instantly, and arced into the forest like a misfired signal flare. A second and third followed. Same result. Each warhead buried itself in the undergrowth, detonating harmlessly among pine trunks already dripping with frost. Only the fourth launcher managed a partial acquisition. Its proximity fuse sensed a moving object at 15 meters, triggering a sphere of tungsten fragments. Drone 8 caught several along its right wing, punching through the composite skin and disrupting airflow. The drone shuddered, dipped, then steadied, damaged but still committed. Zu-23 guns began firing blind, tracer lines wandering through the dawn like frantic brushstrokes. The Shilka radar tried to track the small intruders, failed, reacquired, and failed again. Its computer unable to categorize something this slow and this low. Through that chaos, 3 drones pushed forward, 1, 3, and 7, each sliding into a different approach corridor. The final breach was underway. 4:42 a.m., and the first glow of dawn crept over the pipeline sector. The Russian defenders were still firing upward, blind, frantic, convinced the lingering echoes in the sky were incoming threats. But the real danger was already inside the perimeter. Drone 6 reached the pumping annex first. It was limping badly, altitude wavering with every gust of wind. At 165 kilometers per hour, it clipped the upper wall of the auxiliary station and plunged through the thin metal roof. The impact ruptured a web of feeder pipes, releasing a dense vapor cloud that flashed white as it met the cold air. For exactly 9/10 of a second, the compound hung suspended like frozen breath, before the drone's burning debris ignited it. A rolling burst of orange tore through the annex. Drone 3 came from the east, flying barely above the fence line. It climbed just enough to clear a security tower, before diving straight into the control building at terminal speed. The blast shredded the server racks that governed pressure valves extending for dozens of kilometers. With the command system obliterated, pumps meant to shut down in emergencies simply kept pushing. Pressure surged through the steel arteries faster than the instruments could register. Inside the tank field, tension built. Drone 7 approached Tank 2, one of the larger reservoirs holding over 9,500 tons of petroleum. Its final maneuver was simple. A steep pull-up, a brief stall at apogee, and a vertical plunge. The drone hit the tank's upper quadrant, rupturing the shell plate and sending a geyser of fuel shooting skyward. Drone 8, its wing pocked with holes, drifted off course but still carried momentum. It slammed into the lower section of Tank 3, tearing a crescent-shaped breach along the foundation. 2 compromised tanks, 2 uncontrolled releases, and rising heat from the first fires beginning to wrap the structures. The conditions were perfect. Within moments, the trapped liquid reached flashpoint and transitioned into a boiling liquid expanding vapor event. 10,000 tons of petroleum vaporized almost instantly, expanding to more than 15 million tons of explosive gas. The pressure wave surged outward faster than the eye could track. Steel warped. Storage units collapsed in a chain of ruptures that rippled like thunder rolling across metal. When the shock front faded, the central distribution line lay severed. Valves, control huts, junction nodes, everything that connected the facility to the greater network was gone. A strategic fuel hub worth billions had been taken offline in less than 4 minutes. 5 drones had been lost, 3 had reached their marks, and the dawn rising over the valley had changed shape, marred by a column of smoke climbing into the sky where a pipeline once stood. When the fires finally settled and the first full light touched the valley, the scale of what had unfolded became unmistakable. A handful of low-cost drones had slipped through one of the most defended sectors in western Russia, dismantling a fuel network worth billions in less time than it takes for morning traffic to form in a city street. No grand announcements, no dramatic broadcasts, just precision, timing, and the kind of improvisation that turns small machines into strategic instruments. The wreckage told a simple truth. Even the strongest defenses can fracture when attention is misdirected, when pressure builds in the shadows rather than the spotlight. And once the system fails, it rarely fails quietly. If you were watching this unfold in real time, what moment would have shocked you most? The decoys, the helicopter chase, or the final surge inside the tank field? Share your thoughts below.